Hello everyone, welcome back. This is 2-9 Terminologies in the Compact Redstone series. I'm immune 222, and as the title suggests, today I will talk more about terminologies that you would come across in creating Redstone, or you hear a lot in the piston door community. So I've selected these terminologies specifically to tell you the useful concepts that we will always apply in Redstone. And might as well to give you some background of some misconceptions that people can make with these terminologies. So let's get started by defining what we mean by speed of a piston door. So actually the speed of a piston door is not a single number because there are several ways that you can measure the opening and closing times of a piston door, because we have different values and namings basically. So yeah, it's not a single number basically. And this is from the regulations document of the Redstone Squid's records catalog. I'll just simplify it as regulations documents or regulations for simplicity. Now, besides the fact that there are several numbers that you can measure the speed of a door, there are also different calculations of speed as well. And throughout the series, I have been sticking to the 0.0 plus 0.15 second rule. And the other variants are the 0.1 second rule and the obsolete 0 second rule. So the reason why these three rules occur is that the calculation of speed has been changed throughout the development of Redstone terms, and also actually is more related to Minecraft updates, because one of the updates has changed what we know as block 36. So that is also the reason why the plus 0 second rule is obsolete, because we should consider that the block is still retracting from the door hallway to the door frame, even though it's the last block. So yeah, and to be honest, currently both 0.15 second rule and 0.1 second rule are used, but I'll just stick to the 0.15 second rule because there's a few advantages personally to me. And it just makes timings calculation a bit easier, in my opinion. But yeah, anyway, and just to mention, the naming of the rule is just according to how much time you need to add after the last retraction of a certain piston in the opening time. And the naming is absolutely not universal. In fact, it's very uncreative. And if you're really interested in the actual naming of it, it's actually called the old terms, the new terms, and the newest terms, which is also not creative. It just shows which terms are newer, which terms are older. But yeah, not going to go too deep into that. So the normal closing time, let's just use closing as an example, which means the in-game time period of which the door blocks are moved into the inside of the hallway or tunnel and into the position in the door frame upon activating the inputs. Now, this is actually a bit more confusing. The opening is just similar, but yeah, let me just tell you that yeah, the exact calculation of normal closing time is again will be introduced in 1-11, Introduction to Timings, and 2-4, Tick Counting and Modern Timings. Now, you can see the definitions is actually quite vague and you might be quite confused, but essentially the next equation will explain everything, which is the calculation of normal opening time is the amount of delay, excluding input delay, before last piston retraction of the door block plus 0.15 seconds. And yeah, so yeah, moving on, we'll just define what is input delay. So the closing input delay is the in-game time period between activating the input and the start of the normal closing time. So you can already see this starts to reconcile with what the normal closing time means. And opening input delay means the thing in similar. So now we have something called a reset time. So closing reset time, which means the in-game time period between the end of the visible closing time and the time at which the input can be toggled to open the door. Opening reset time is similar. So again, from the regulations. And now we can finally talk about what the total time of a piston door is. It's basically the input delay plus the normal time plus the reset time, and you can just add in the terms closing or opening and then respective. So yeah, basically this equation is the most important, I guess. So it basically explains everything that you need to know about speed of a piston door. So next, we will move on from explaining the speed of a piston door and talk about legitimacy, because as door makers that are competitive, so basically competitive door makers, we want to make sure that our doors or contraptions made are legitimate and can actually be compared with others. So unfortunately, there is no official definition for legitimacy, but then there's another term that is similar to legitimacy, which is called eligibility, which actually partially describes the legitimacy. So there are several eligibility criteria. The first being that the contraption should have a legal input. This I've explained it in 1.1-5 input methods, and surprisingly, having a legal input is actually a recent criteria that is added to the legitimacy sections, in which this is proposed by me. So I do have some experience in formulating terminologies, I guess. But yeah, anyways, that's not the important point. So let's just talk about more criteria for eligibility. So it has to be reliable. So the contraption must work every single time, no matter how many time. Actually, that is not really. Yeah, anyway, so it just has to work every time you activate or deactivate it. And the next thing being that the contraption should work in a finite operating time. Now, we define finite being not infinite. So if there is any chance that the contraption may work indefinitely in terms of its operating time, then we say that the contraption is not legit, because it basically just is determined by the probability of certain Minecraft features. And yeah, it's basically reliant on if they would be updated, for example, out of luck. So this also explains why Redstone ore update is unlegit, because Redstone ore update, you can say is random. Although you can calculate a mean time for it, but that doesn't mean that it has a finite time. It can be infinite. Although the probability would go to 0 if you learn more about probability. But then as long as you don't know exactly when the contraption will actually fully complete, then we would say that it has a chance of not having a finite operating time. So yeah, that explained. I probably explained it too much, and yeah. The next thing is that it should have unlimited number of uses. So you cannot have a contraption that only works for one time or several times and it doesn't work. This would be unlegit. However, this excludes Nether Portal igniting system, because we know that Nether Portal's igniting system would always use the durability of a flint and steel, or just use up fire charges, so which will always have finite number of uses. So this is excluded. The next thing is that the contraption must not depend on the biome or the weather all the time for operation, because you may have some contraptions that would not work during the day or during the night if you're using daylight sensor, for example, or in some cases that some biomes or weather will also affect the contraption, then it's not legit. So, and the next thing is that it doesn't rely on mob AI to function. So this is particularly important if you are using mobs, because you need to check if what the mob does actually relies on mob AI. So I'm not really familiar with the mob AI things, but basically, for example, if you have some villager that is programmed such that it will always travel to a certain direction using mob AI, then it doesn't. Then it's not counted as legitimate. Although people do those stuff just for fun, probably. And also, I guess one important note is that recently observerless doors have been using witches, because witches are basically the only mobs that can heal themselves fast enough in case they suffocate. And witches drinking potion actually does not require mob AI to function. So actually using witches and having them regenerate by themselves is actually legitimate. So yeah. And next thing is that it does not require cheats to build. So what this basically implies is that the build must be able to build in survival. So this actually really depends on how obscure your contraption is, because some contraptions may have some floating components, for example floating redstone torches, pressure plates, and yeah, those things. And in case if you cannot find a way that you can manipulate those floating objects in survival, then it's counted as not legitimate. So for example, I'm not quite sure if this is true, but in 1.19 update suppression doesn't really work, I think. I'm not sure, I'm not really that updated with the technical news. And although there are some people saying that you can use other methods, but just saying that in case if you cannot find any solutions to do the floating mechanism, then it basically counts as not legitimate. So yeah. And the final thing is that it does not use non-vanilla behavior, because yeah, you are basically using codes or components that would not work otherwise in vanilla. Then that means that you're basically modifying the game in order to make your contraption work, which is just not legitimate. So yeah, this is why this is added. So yeah, all of these are just from the regulations documents, and I've just summarized it into point forms for easy understanding. So there are also some parts of legitimacy that is not in the eligibility criteria, but then I would just include them here because I think these are also quite important. Is that there are no obstructing hitboxes in the hallway. This actually never been said, although it is an informal agreement, which is that you cannot have, for example, repeaters or comparators in the hallway. But then if the components are transparent, for example, dust and torches, then they're basically allowed. So yeah, you just cannot have any obstructing hitboxes, like any blocks that actually occupy space. So that's not allowed. Yeah, and some people are against it. I used to be against this, but nowadays I don't really care too much. But yeah, anyways, that's not the important thing. And the second thing is that the contraption must not be affected by any player or mob actions outside the door volume. Now, why is this important? This is due to the scope sensor addition in 1.19, which is that people have started to use scope sensors in inappropriate ways, such that any player, like some player actions or some mob actions outside the door volume may actually affect the door itself. So you just have to basically ensure that any player actions or mob actions outside the door volume will still enable the door or contraption itself to work. And otherwise, if you need to have specific block placements, or if you have special conditions that players and mobs have to behave or not behave in a certain way in order to have your door or contraption to work, then this is not legit. So yeah, basically that's that. And yeah, we have fully talked about the legitimacy, and I'll talk about one of the most debatable things. It's not really debatable, it's actually well defined here. It's even more well defined than legitimacy, but people have some misconceptions about this terminology, which is uncontained. So what do we mean by uncontained? So it basically means that well, this is actually the definition of contained, but yeah, it basically means the build still works with any combination of air or hand-placed quartz-like or immovable blocks surrounding it. So again, just copying from the regulations documents. So yeah, and this doesn't really explain too much anything, to be honest. So let's just list out some common scenarios of uncontainers. So what do we have? So for example, we have moving slime or honey on the outer layer of a piston door or a contraption. Then this is uncontained because the slime or honey will always stick to any blocks outside of the door volume, and you're basically moving it, so it is not contained. I mean, it still works, but to be honest, it doesn't, because you can already see from the definition that in case if you have immovable blocks, any combinations we are saying. So if you have one quartz block and one immovable block such that the slime cannot extend or retract, basically just cannot function, then it's uncontained. So you have to add an extra layer. So that's why the moving slime or honey on the outer layer will not be contained. Another is that an obsidian is placed at the bottom of fast 5x5 doors, which disallows the top triple from working. Now this is actually a very special scenario, which not many people recognize it until a later stage. That's what happens is, due to insufficient block event delay, if you place an obsidian on the bottom of some fast 5x5, saying 1.05 or 0.9 seconds, and yeah, basically the top triple would not work due to the obsidian placed. And yeah, this is actually quite a bit weird. It's very hard to explain it to you, but then I'm sure the competitive Redstoners have already know this case. So yeah, their awareness has been increasing. So yeah, just saying it out. The next scenario would be solid blocks placed at the output of an observer facing upwards or sideways, which will quasi-power components which will break the contraption. Now this is very normal for basically observer builds, because you would sometimes have observers that are next to pistons or droppers. Dispensers are less likely, but yeah, droppers and pistons. That the observer powering actually will affect the pistons or dropper adjacent to the observer if you place a solid block next to the observer powering block. So this means that if the contraption doesn't function due to that solid block place, then it would be uncontained. So yeah, just imagine it, I guess. And lastly is that if there are entities outside the door volume, then it's uncontained, because there are, quite frankly, some, for example, one wide builds that has used some entities that are basically too wide, so that will be uncontained already. So yeah, and yeah, just one more point is that uncontained builds must add the respective layers to make the build contained to be able to compare with contained builds, because we normally count the volume based on contained volume, not uncontained volumes. And if your contraption happens to be uncontained, you have to add the respective layers to make the contraption be contained in order to compare with contained builds. And this is why uncontained builds are significantly at a disadvantage comparing to contained builds. So yeah, just be aware. And here comes the common misconception, even though I've already listed out the most likely scenarios that you would face. So misconception 1: if the contraption powers any redstone components outside the contraption, it is uncontained. Now this is actually a very weird view by some people, because this basically means every contraption will be uncontained. And I'm not sure if they have considered this thing, but yeah. Uncontained doesn't mean that you cannot have anything that powers outside of the contraption. It just means that any combination of quartz-like or immovable blocks on the exterior of the volume would still allow the contraption to work. Not that if you have anything that powers on exterior, then and the thing fails, then it isn't contained. So yeah, just be aware. And this is also basically one of the principles that you are not supposed to have any exterior redstone components adjacent to the contraption, because you may affect how the contraption works. I will also cover this point a bit more later. The second point, misconception, is that if the contraption has an upwards or sideways observer with adjacent quasi-connectivity affected components, then it is uncontained. Now, this is actually not true. The reason why it's not true is that only when the contraption breaks due to placing any combination of blocks surrounding the build will it be uncontained. What this means is that if somehow placing the solid block, for example, next to the observer, even though it may quasi-connect and power the quasi-affected components, if the contraption still works, then it's actually still contained. So you just have to make sure that the contraption works with any combination of blocks, of solid blocks or immovable blocks or whatever. So yeah, and basically don't boldly assume uncontainedness. Like, even though you may see an observer that may quasi-power a piston, for example, if there's a block in front of it, you would know that this may be an uncontained issue, but you cannot be sure if it is actually uncontained unless you test it. So yeah, make sure that you are able to identify that. And the last misconception is that if the contraption can be broken by any exterior updates or powering, is uncontained. Now, this is basically the principle that I've just mentioned in the first misconception, which is that contraptions are actually not supposed to handle any exterior updates or powering or exterior updaters. Here shown. Because although we are restricting our contraption at a certain volume, it is unavoidable that our circuits will always be affected by exterior components. Therefore, we usually would notify the users what to avoid when they build the contraption. Now, this is not related to uncontainedness, because as we have seen in the uncontained definition, that it is only when placing any combination of solid or obsidian immovable blocks and the contraption fails, then it's uncontained. So by this definition, then you can see this is basically a misconception. And this also violates the principle that you're not supposed to place anything on the side of a contraption if you don't know how the contraption works, or yeah, basically that. So just be careful. And yeah, so moving on to the resources. So basically you already see that there are a lot of referencing from the terminologies documents, so basically the regulations documents. So there are two sets of regulations documents. The second set will be used now because it's newer and is revised and updated, I guess. But the first one will still remain as a reference for you if you really need it. So yeah, thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something about terminologies, and I will see you in the next one.